Pleasure for us to have Rabbi Dr. Simcha Raphael with us for this entire weekend. He started with us on Friday evening and Shabbos. On Saturday night, we heard him over at Traditional Congregation as part of the Tikkun. If you missed that one really you shouldn't have missed. It was very special and a wonderful opportunity to gather his community. And then we had a chance to hear him on Shabbos here in Shul, and then again, we heard him yesterday, and we get to hear him today in preparation for Yizkor, and I've been very much looking forward to this particular talk since we started talking about the notion of Reb Simcha visiting with us. I also want to extend a thank you to Paul and Deanne Gallant, and Paul is going to introduce our speaker in just a moment, for their dedication to raising the intellectual and spiritual bar of the congregation. It takes special people to understand that as much as we do wonderful work on a regular basis, everybody needs, every once in a while, a kind of a ringer. And the ringer comes in and adds a little bit to our intellectual, spiritual, holiness quotient through the work that they do. And so I want to thank them, and they've already committed to several talks for next year as well, and we're looking forward to announcing that on the high holidays. We'll announce all the details, because Paul hasn't told me what I'm doing yet, so as soon as he tells me, I'll be able to announce it. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul will now introduce our guest speaker, our scholar in residence, who will introduce for us the Yizkor, the memorial service. If you are honored today with opening the Aron HaKodesh or holding one of the scrolls of the Torah, I'd ask you please to make your way to the front of the sanctuary so that we can move seamlessly from the presentation of Reb Simcha into the Yizkor, the memorial service. And if you don't yet have one of the blue booklets, we'll make sure that you get one in just a few moments.
Well, it's certainly our pleasure, Deanne not here today, and I think everybody in the congregation understands what's going on in that life. But it's my pleasure today to introduce Rabbi Simcha Raphael, PhD. But before we do that, everything in life is timing. So when the rabbi and I sat down months and months and months ago and began to plan out these particular Shabbat series of speakers, this one was extraordinarily appropriate with Yizkor today. So I think the rabbi doctor has given us a tremendous view of, or his views of death, the hereafter, and what life is all about. So he's been working as a death awareness educator for over 25 years, psychotherapist, specializing in bereavement and spiritual counseling. And a longtime member of Germantown Jewish Center, Simcha is author of the book, Jewish Views of Afterlife. He has been around the congregation now for several days and with traditional, and I'm sure we've all heard him, and needs no further introduction, but my new friend, Rabbi Dr.
Good Yontif, Chag Sameach. It's just been wonderful to be here. The melodies in this congregation, the architecture in this congregation, the rabbis in this congregation, the young people who get up here, whoever developed Yad Squad, that's a brilliant idea. It's just so fantastic to be in this vibratory field, and I thank the Chazanit and rabbis for inviting me here this Shabbos, this Yontif. So we're about to say Yizkor, and this Dvar Torah will serve as an introduction. Just take a second and realize there's people all around the world on all of the continents saying Yizkor this morning. Even though Shavuos is not like a big time ticket, they're in Europe and they're in South America and in Africa and Asia, and I understand there's a cyber minion of scientists in Antarctica. So we're aligning with Jews both in geography and also in history. And I'm going to speak a little bit about the history of Yizkor, but there's been generations and generations and generations of men and women who have said prayers for Yizkor. Yizkor is a Hebrew word which is remembrance. It's sometimes called by the traditional name Haskarat Neshamot, the remembrance of souls. It's an ancient prayer, a memorial service that honors those who've died 4 times a year, Yom Kippur and the last days of Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuot during the morning services. And today, we think of Yizkor as a kind of effective, efficacious bereavement ritual, a chance to remember our loved ones with respect and honor. But when we look at how Yizkor was understood traditionally, we might see it in a somewhat different way. And I want to speak about the spiritual roots of Yizkor and suggest that it really is a soul-guiding ritual. A ritual and a liturgy that mediates the relationship between the world of the living and the world beyond. So I want to offer a bit of a bird's eye view of the historical evolution of Yizkor. So the earliest references to a prayer on behalf of the dead dates back to Hasmonean times. Remember the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans? They're like the dudes from the Maccabees, right? So that's how far back. That's at least 2,000 years. And the book of Maccabees talks about how Judah the Maccabee and his cohorts offered prayers and temple sacrifices on behalf of their fallen comrades, on behalf of the war dead, if you will, quote, that they might be set free from their sins. So there's an understanding that their offering of sacrifices mediates the state of their soul in the world beyond. That's in our tradition going back 2,000 years. Later, in rabbinic texts, we have this legacy that through their actions, human beings are able to purify and redeem souls of the dead. I'm not exactly sure what that means, though I did make some allusion to it on Saturday night, but let's at least see what our texts tell us. Midrash Tanchuma and elsewhere, there's this idea that the living have a responsibility to redeem the dead, quote, in order to save them from Gehenna and cleanse them from their sins. Now, scholarship indicates that it was likely some form of charity. Again, we do this today. We offer tzedakah on behalf of one who has died, but it's offered with the understanding that it's an atonement to have a beneficent effect on the state of their soul in the afterlife. That's when they say redeem the dead, they mean we can have some impact on the state of beings on the other side. Now, very early, it was understood to be a two-way street. The dead could intercede in the affairs of the living, and the living would do things to be able to intercede in the post-mortem, in the afterlife fate of the dead. So in the Talmud, we read about how Caleb, one of the spies, one of the good guys of the spies, prostrates himself on the graves of the patriarchs and matriarchs at Hebron, petitioning their assistance. He goes, he gets to the Holy Land, he dials 1-900 psychic to be able to attune to the patriarchs and the matriarchs. Tanit makes it clear, the tractate Tanit makes it clear that one goes to the cemetery, quote, in order that the dead should intercede for mercy on our behalf. It's a two-way street, but at least we have this traditional understanding that beings on the other side are available as beneficent intercessors in our lives. The living prayed for the souls of the dead, and the dead were able to offer, usually it was help around shidduchim and health and children. That was sort of the specialty. Long before there was J-date, there were deceased grandmothers who were making shidduchim for people. So this was at least how our ancient ancestors understood the connection between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Moving forward in time, medieval death literature is full of prayers asking the dead to intervene and for spouses and children. And I mentioned this in one of my previous talks, but I've done a lot of reading of late medieval and early modern Jewish death liturgy. And there's actually prayers that are not just addressed, when going to the cemetery, prayers that are not just addressed to God, but are literally addressed to the deceased. And again, I mentioned that, but we see that in Eastern European folk tradition and in Fiddler on the Roof. Fruma Sarah and Seitel are actively involved in choosing a marriage partner for Tevye's daughter. So this is the philosophical and spiritual point of view that underlies the tradition of Yizkor. So it turns out the tradition of saying Yizkor is 900 years old. Scholars agree that this liturgical practice of memorializing the dead began in the Rhineland, what we would call Germany today, following the First Crusade. The First Crusade was in 1096. It was really the first experience of mega death. There had been anti-Semitic incidences over the previous 1,000 years, but really, Yizkor becomes a communal response to trauma and mega death. There were major massacres of Jews at the time of the First Crusade, and then later at the time of the Black Plague, which was about 200 years later, when the Jews were accused of poisoning the wells. So memorial prayers for the martyred dead and the reading of name lists, just like we do with 9/11 today, were done for those who died, quote, al kiddush Hashem, for the sanctification of the name. And so this practice of memorializing those who had died in these massacres were incorporated into specific Shabbatot. Since the slaughter of the Jews in the Rhineland occurred close to Shavuot, there was a Shavuot during the period of the Omer, which was called a Martyr's Shabbat. And since the second rampage took place closer to Tisha B'Av, there was also something called Shabbat Shachor. It's named after some musical band. Shabbat Shachor is Black Sabbath. So I guess they named it after a rock and roll band or something like that. So that's the earliest level of Yizkor prayers, and over the next 2 centuries, this practice of memorializing the dead expanded first in the Germanic and then later in the Sephardic communities. So these memorial days became fixed, and they would recite the names of those martyred, and then somebody would come along and say, wait a minute, I made a big donation to this congregation, and I want my ancestors to be remembered also. So they added the names of the machers also, the shulmachers. I mean, we're very good at that. You know, you go into a Jewish building, and this is named in memory of that, and that is named in memory of this, and this is named in memory of that. That's part of how we memorialize. So then Yizkor becomes another name list is entered of the leaders of the congregation. And what's interesting is the martyrs who died al kiddush Hashem, in sanctification of God's name, didn't need redemption of sin. Why? Because kiddush Hashem, dying in God's name, was already an atonement. But the community leaders needed such a redemption. Again, that's the operating belief. We will memorialize them, but they also needed to have, in a sense, their souls redeemed. And when is a good time to do that? When's our main holiday of praying for redemption? Yom Kippur. So Yom Kippur then emerges, particularly because we're giving tzedakah. The Torah reading for Yom Kippur begins with the words acharei mot, after the death. See, we use Torah as a grid for our lives, so all of a sudden these holidays, this memorial service migrates towards Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a day of fasting. Yom Kippur is a day of giving tzedakah, and so this is what happens. We give tzedakah and we remember the dead, and then we get our first Yom Kippur Yizkor liturgy emerges. Then another problem emerges. Okay, so the machers are getting a chance to have their family members named. What about me? I'm just plain simple Jewish stock. What about Joe and Jane Jew? So then you get individual families who wanted to memorialize the name of deceased relatives who were neither martyrs nor communal members. So this practice, which is almost 400 years after the Crusades, around 1400, 1500, becomes the paradigm for our current day Haskarat Nishamot. It's a family memorial liturgy. So Yizkor didn't just come onto the scene. It sort of emerged in stages. And at first, it's only at Yom Kippur when Yizkor is recited, and not much earlier than the 16th century. So then the question is, when did the Shalosh Regalim, when did the three pilgrimage festivals come onto the scene? Well, that's later. That's the 16th and 17th century. And on one hand, a festival celebrating joyously, Zman Simchatenu, is almost anomalous for mourning and memorializing the dead. But there was a certain kind of wisdom that our ancestors had in choosing the Shalosh Regalim, because Judaism does advocate for the intermingling of life and death. We celebrate the joys and also the oys of life. I mean, Judaism is very good at that. At the end of Sukkot, the end of Pesach, at the end of Shavuot. But there's also something inherent in the Torah once again. This morning, somebody read, I think it was the fourth Aliyah, you had this phrase, Ish kamatnat yado. Everyone will bring to the temple on the pilgrimage festivals, each according to the gift of the hand. Basically, you are taxed according to your income status. Each according to the gift of the hand. So matnat yad was understood to be gifts of tzedakah. They were for the upkeep of the congregation, and they were to redeem the souls of the dead. So matnat yad became understood to be a charitable donation that was redemptive for the dead. And then I'm going to need to come in for a landing soon, but I want to update it to more modern times. Rabbi Stephen Wise talks about something called Minhag America, the American matbeya, the American liturgical style. With the movement to North America, the liturgical style of Yizkor changes profoundly. It gets to be much more flowery and much more expansive. Why? Because our ancestors left behind their family members and often the graves of their parents and grandparents in Europe. In my house, I have a picture of my grandmother and her two sisters with candlesticks on their parents' gravestone. They were wealthy enough to get a photographer, I guess, in just after World War I, to come out to the cemetery and take that picture, because they knew they would never see their parents' tombstone again, and that became the connection to their lineage of the ancestors. So Yizkor in America starts becoming much more flowery to assuage the guilt that people have for having abandoned their family in the old world, which was very common for the immigrant generation. So in the 19th and 20th century, you see this very amplified Yom Kippur Yizkor service. And it, from a psychological perspective, it gives people a sense of a catharsis, a chance to not so much redeem souls of the dead. By then, we've lost touch with that. But rather, in the rationalist spirit, the prayers are dedicated much more to God, and we step back away from the initial understanding of this connection with spirits in the world beyond. So in the 1950s and 1960s, it becomes the family bereavement ritual. And if you look at some of the readings in the New Conservative Machzor or in Kol HaNeshama, the Reconstructionist Machzor, it's very psychologically oriented. It's a wonderful collection of readings for the bereaved, and we've come a long way from redeeming souls of the dead. We're no longer in the shadow of the First Crusade, and we understand a lot more about bereavement. And Yizkor, like Shiva, Kaddish, Yortzeit, has an effective bereavement quality. But where I want to go is that we need to reclaim the initial intention of what Yizkor was about. That the history of Yizkor reminds us that the recitation of memorial prayers was always a way of negotiating the relationship between the world of the living and the souls of the dead, between our loved ones in the world beyond and the connection in our heart with those beings. There's an ongoing connection between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And we're living in a time of spiritual renewal, spiritual yearning. And many people I know do feel a sense of connection with their loved ones. In our rationalist culture, we believe dead is dead. You pull the plug and you're out of here. But in Jewish tradition and practice, we have a sense that between the world of the living and the world of the dead is a window and not a wall. Between the world of the living and the world of the dead is a window and not a wall. And we often feel that sense of connection and that guiding presence of loved ones. So today, in this time of divine revelation, let us remember Yizkor provides us that rich opportunity to attune to the soul and the spirit of loved ones. Just as we are remembering God's presence at Sinai and that we're on the way to the promised land, we also want to remember that we're sons and daughters of parents, we're siblings, spouses, and although they're no longer alive, we're deeply connected with those beings, with their souls, and with our own life destiny. And may our Yizkor prayers today allow us to feel that guiding presence of loved ones as intercessors and as spiritual guides in our lives. And may we find a way to invite their ongoing participation in our hearts, in our homes, in our family life. So with about a few moments left, I do want to offer a short kavanah.
Please.
For Yizkor to help us prepare. So, kavanah is related to the Hebrew word kivun, which means direction. So the direction of a kavanah is inward. So I want to share something with you. A good way to do it inwardly, if you're comfortable enough, is to close your eyes and take a deep breath. I'm a pretty easygoing guy. If you want to keep your eyes open and breathe shallow, that's also okay. But I want to offer a kind of warm up on the inside for our Yizkor service that the Chazan will begin when I complete here. So I invite you to close your eyes and take a deep breath and just let these words filter through you. Jewish tradition, in its wisdom, teaches us that between the world of the living and the world of the dead, there's a window and not a wall. In our culture, we often believe that dead is dead, and after death, the channels of communication between us and loved ones who have died are ended. A brick wall. But like the rituals of Shiva, Kaddish, and Yortzeit, Yizkor opens windows to the unseen worlds of the dead. Yizkor creates a sacred space and time wherein we can open our hearts and minds to the possibility of genuine interconnection with beloved family members, friends who have left behind the world of the living. Yizkor is a window. Again, if you can close your eyes, prepare to open that window. As you prepare to recite your Yizkor prayers, allow your senses and imagination to be the vehicle for interconnection. For whom are you saying Yizkor today? Are there 1, 2, 3, or more people? Perhaps 1 or 2 might come to your awareness. Can you imagine that person's face before your eyes? See their smile. Visualize how they might be carrying their body standing next to you. You might even be able to get a scent of their presence. And allow yourself to feel their presence in this moment now. Do you recall the sound of their voice? Hear their words as you prepare to stand in prayer. Feel their presence in this moment and allow a conversation to emerge between the two of you. What's the message you need to hear today? What do you need to say to each other? What do you need to hear? What remains unsaid? In this timeless moment, allow the radiance of their love to be with you right now. Yizkor teaches us to remember the dead. Long after people die, their legacy lives on inside of us. Within the well springs of our infinite souls, we find that window of connection between the living and the dead. So just hold that place in silence as we prepare for our Yizkor service this morning.